"You're a beggar, old man." The words echoed in the high-rise office lobby like a cold slap. Malcolm stood at the edge of the polished marble floor, shoulders straight, long grey beard glinting under the fluorescent lights. His eyes remained steady, calm, unshaken, a storm contained within. Around him, the chatter of employees dimmed as if the world itself had paused, waiting for the next act. His wife, Laverne, stood in the center of the lobby, hand pointed like a spear, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her heels clicked on the floor as she repeated the insult, loud enough for Malcolm's boss, a tall, stoic man in his 50s, to turn mid-step, eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. Malcolm's lips did not move. He did not flinch. His hands remained by his sides. The silence carried more weight than her screams, as if the air itself recognized the arrogance of the woman before him. Laverne's face burned red with anger and pride, her eyes blazing with self-righteousness. "I'm done with this," she shouted. "I've humiliated myself long enough living under your shadow." Malcolm's gaze swept slowly to his boss, Mr. Anderson, who now stood frozen in the doorway of his office, unsure how to intervene. Malcolm's calm demeanor, the dignity in his posture, and the measured silence were louder than any defense could have been. He reached slowly into his briefcase, removed a single sheet of paper, and signed it with a deliberate stroke. No glance at his wife, no words, just the silent authority of a man who knew the power of timing and patience. The pen scratched across the paper, a small sound that carried far more threat than her anger had. Laverne's jaw dropped as she caught sight of the paper, a legal document she hadn't noticed. Malcolm folded it carefully and slipped it back into his briefcase, still without a word. Her lips trembled. Pride had been replaced with a creeping unease. "What is that?" she spat, fury mingled with confusion. Malcolm's eyes didn't answer. They merely conveyed the quiet finality of someone who had anticipated betrayal and arrogance long before it surfaced. The employees who had paused now whispered amongst themselves, casting curious, sympathetic glances toward him. Laverne, realizing she had lost not only the moral upper hand, but also any tangible leverage, stormed toward the elevator. Her heels clicked furiously, echoing in the silent corridor. "This isn't over," she screamed over her shoulder. Malcolm remained where he was, still as stone, his beard slightly damp from the early morning mist that had clung to his coat when he arrived. He breathed in slowly, letting the air fill him with measured calm. He glanced at Mr. Anderson, who nodded subtly, recognition of a man whose patience and dignity could not be shaken. Then Malcolm picked up the phone from his desk, a small, unassuming device that would change everything in 30 minutes. He dialed a number with care, pressing each button as if performing a ritual. Each tone was deliberate, precise, echoing slightly in the polished office. Laverne's voice continued its furious march down the hall, now directed at anyone who would listen. "I can't believe he thinks he's above me," she shouted. "I won't let him humiliate me in front of everyone." Malcolm's eyes, however, were fixed somewhere far beyond the lobby, beyond the shouting, beyond the insult. They were calm, quiet, and filled with a silent promise. A promise that pride, when wielded carelessly, would always meet consequence. 30 minutes later, the high-pitched shrill of a horn echoed outside the office building. A small commotion stirred in the lobby, as Laverne, now pale and shaking, turned toward the glass doors. Outside, a uniformed officer stood firmly, pen in hand, holding a citation and a stern expression. Behind him, another officer nodded, confirming authority. Laverne froze. Her anger, her self-righteousness, and her power had all dissipated in an instant. She tried to retreat, but the weight of the papers in the officer's hand and the authority they represented grounded her. For the first time, fear replaced fury. Malcolm stood behind his desk, calm as ever, watching her reaction. The employees who had witnessed her earlier triumph now whispered amongst themselves, eyes wide. No one spoke, as if the silence itself held the final verdict. Laverne's lips quivered, and for the first time she felt the cold sting of helplessness. She had mocked, insulted, and tried to dominate the man before her, and 30 minutes later the balance had shifted entirely. Malcolm did not move. He did not speak. His long grey beard shimmered faintly under the office lights, a visual emblem of time, wisdom, and authority that Laverne had underestimated at her own peril. She swallowed hard, stepping back. And finally, just barely above a whisper, she said, "Dad, I—" But the words never completed. Malcolm's calm gaze the document he signed, and the small, quiet phone call had already spoken for him. And in the silence of that lobby, surrounded by shocked onlookers, Laverne realized that karma had arrived, and she was powerless to resist it. The office had not fully recovered from the shock of Laverne's public humiliation when the phone rang. Malcolm's fingers, steady and deliberate, lifted the receiver. His long grey beard cast faint shadows on his chest as he spoke softly, calmly, each word measured, intentional. "Good afternoon," he said, voice calm yet authoritative. "I need immediate action. A complaint has been filed under my name, and it requires prompt enforcement." By the time Laverne returned from the lobby, hoping to regain some control over the situation, the first officer had already issued a formal notice, a citation that froze certain privileges and invoked official intervention. The hum of office life seemed to fade into the background as everyone watched her pale face, realizing that her insult had triggered a chain of consequences far larger than she anticipated. Her steps faltered as she attempted to speak to Malcolm, but he only met her gaze with steady, unyielding calm. The employees around whispered quietly, casting glances between the shivering woman and the composed elder at the desk. His silence carried more power than any argument she could muster. Outside the glass doors, a second officer arrived, confirming the enforcement of what Malcolm had quietly set into motion. Their presence was professional, unyielding yet not overbearing, the authority simply existing, a direct manifestation of the father's silent planning. Laverne's voice trembled as she tried to assert herself. This is ridiculous. "Oh, you can't," she began, only to be interrupted by the officer's calm but firm tone. "Ma'am, please step outside. We need to clarify the situation," one of them said. "It's procedural and it requires your cooperation." Malcolm's eyes softened slightly, but not in apology. They carried quiet wisdom, a look that told Laverne she had underestimated the gravity of his patience, the depth of his foresight. She turned toward the glass doors and hesitated. The storm outside had subsided, leaving the pavement wet and reflective, almost mirroring her own shaken image. Stepping outside, Laverne was met by the sight of a small but serious crowd, some neighbors, a few passerby, and the officers. Her heels sank slightly in the wet concrete as the weight of the situation began to settle in. The document Malcolm had signed earlier now had tangible, immediate effect, a legal instrument that temporarily immobilized certain accounts, confirmed procedural oversight, and placed the responsibility squarely on her shoulders. Her knees almost buckled as she looked up, eyes wide, realizing the magnitude of what had happened in a mere 30 minutes. 30 minutes, time enough for her arrogance to be challenged, for the balance to shift, for humility to arrive unbidden. Inside the lobby, Malcolm returned to his desk, leaning back slightly, his long grey beard casting subtle shadows across his chest. He did not move toward her. He did not raise his voice. He simply observed, calm and collected, as the natural consequences of her pride unfurled. She finally sank to a nearby bench outside, head in hands, trembling as she processed the humiliation. She had gone from arrogance to desperation faster than she had ever imagined. Her mind raced, grasping for excuses, for control, for any semblance of authority she thought she had over Malcolm. But he had anticipated everything. Every insult, every gesture of pride, every public display of scorn, he had already prepared for it. And now, watching the officers confirm the paperwork, the reality of her miscalculation hit her fully. One officer approached her gently but firmly. "Ma'am, you'll need to comply with these procedures. Any obstruction could escalate the situation further." Her lips quivered. I didn't mean—" The words faltered. Pride, for the first time in years, had been replaced by fear. And as she looked across the wet pavement, through the glass doors of the office, she saw Malcolm's silhouette, calm, composed, utterly unshaken. The man she had mocked now held complete control, yet he had not raised a hand. The tension was almost palpable. The employees inside had gathered near the windows, watching silently as the daughter of arrogance struggled to maintain composure. The narrative had shifted entirely, from a public insult to a personal reckoning that none could ignore. Laverne's eyes welled with tears. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Dad, help me." But Malcolm remained still, seated at his desk, long grey beard brushing lightly against the edge of the table, radiating calm authority. The silence was deliberate, the pause weighty, and yet in that very stillness she felt the undeniable truth. The balance of power had shifted, and she had no path back except humility. Outside, the rain-soaked pavement reflected the offices, the office building, and the woman's despair, like a mirror of her own fallen pride. 30 minutes earlier, she had believed herself untouchable. Now the world seemed to have condensed into the simple truth of consequence, a father's quiet wisdom versus a momentary lapse of respect. Malcolm finally picked up the phone again, a gesture almost imperceptible, dialing a number with calm precision. A few words were exchanged, terse and soft, almost inaudible, and yet every phrase carried unspoken authority. By the time the call ended, Laverne was trembling, her posture broken, and she instinctively raised her hands in silent surrender. The officer's expression softened, professional yet aware of the quiet orchestration at work. The story was no longer hers to control, and in that long pause between raindrops, between office chatter and street noise, Malcolm's long grey beard shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights, a visual emblem of endurance, wisdom, and quiet revenge that had unfolded without a single harsh word. The air was thick with tension, humiliation, and realization. Laverne now understood fully. In 30 minutes, her arrogance had met the weight of patience, and the consequences were irreversible. Laverne's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the wet bench outside the office, the rain-soaked pavement reflecting the fluorescent glow from the building behind her. Her mind raced, a chaotic storm of fear, disbelief, and humiliation. In less than an hour, the woman who had commanded attention and respect within her social circles had been reduced to trembling under the weight of consequences she never imagined could arrive so swiftly. She looked up, catching sight of Malcolm inside the office, seated behind his polished desk, long grey beard resting neatly against his chest, eyes calm yet piercing. He did not move. He did not speak. But every line of his posture, every subtle tilt of his head communicated authority far beyond the reach of words. He had anticipated every insult, every public slight, and had already orchestrated a response that left no room for dispute. The officers outside approached carefully, their professionalism tempered with awareness. One gently placed a hand on Laverne's shoulder. "Ma'am, you need to follow the procedure. Any delay could escalate the situation." She flinched, pulling back instinctively, but she knew it was futile. Every step she had taken to assert dominance, to insult, to undermine, had led her here. Her pride, once a shield, had become a liability. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she realized the depth of her miscalculation. This was no ordinary reprimand or scolding. It was calculated, silent, precise. The work of a man who understood patience and power better than she could ever comprehend. Her humiliation was public, undeniable, and utterly complete. The employees inside watched through the glass, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some were shocked. Others were silently grateful for the poetic display of consequence. Laverne had been confident, even smug, and now she was undone, stripped of arrogance in the most visible way imaginable. Malcolm rose slowly, moving toward the office window. He did not speak, but his gaze found hers. In that moment, she felt a mixture of fear and regret, a bitter taste she had never experienced. This was not just about the insult. It was about understanding the gravity of disrespect. The officers spoke again, delivering the formal documents that had been enacted through Malcolm's phone call. Her privileges, once assumed, were now suspended. Accounts, assets, and positions she had taken for granted were temporarily frozen. She was forced to confront the fact that authority and consequence were not dictated by emotion, but by planning and calm precision. Laverne sank fully onto the bench, her knees weak, her hands covering her face. She had fought, screamed, and belittled, but in 30 minutes she had been rendered powerless. The weight of the father's quiet wisdom pressed down upon her, unseen, undeniable, and absolute. The wind shifted, carrying faint remnants of rain across the office plaza. She shivered, both from the damp and from the dawning realization of her mistake. Her mouth opened as if to plead, to negotiate, to reclaim some fragment of control. but no words could find purchase. Every syllable she might have spoken would be drowned by the gravity of her own failure. Inside, Malcolm's long grey beard caught the edge of sunlight spilling through the high windows, casting a subtle glow that framed his composed face. He picked up the signed document again, a simple gesture, and placed it neatly on his desk. No flourish, no triumph, only order and precision. His silence had already delivered the lesson more forcefully than any shouting could. Time seemed to stretch. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the small drama unfolding on the plaza. Yet for Laverne, every second was excruciating. 30 minutes ago, she had believed herself untouchable. Now she was a woman brought low by her own arrogance, forced to reckon with a power she had consistently underestimated. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, she muttered, voice breaking, "Dad, please, I didn't know." Her words trailed into the cold air, but Malcolm remained inside, seated, immovable. He did not reply because no reply was necessary. His patience, his long planning, and the quiet execution of consequence spoke far louder than any words could. The employees returned to their desks, whispers fading into the hum of work, but Laverne stayed on the bench, frozen. The officer's presence remained a subtle, silent pressure, an external manifestation of the authority Malcolm had quietly unleashed. She was trapped by the inevitability of consequence, by the precise orchestration of justice she had failed to anticipate. The humiliation had reached its peak, yet Malcolm's lesson was not yet complete. The silence of the father, the calm precision of his actions, and the public unraveling of her pride created a tableau of poetic justice that would remain in her memory forever. As the sun broke through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement, Laverne realized the truth. For every action of arrogance there is a consequence, and for every insult a reckoning waits. Patient and inevitable, she lowered her head, finally understanding that no argument, no charm, no apology could undo what had begun. She had been humbled, stripped, and left to contemplate the depth of her misjudgment. And somewhere inside the office, Malcolm's eyes remained calm, his long grey beard a symbol of time, wisdom and enduring authority, reminding her silently that patience, foresight and dignity always win over anger, pride and impulsiveness. Laverne sat hunched on the cold, rain-speckled bench outside the office, her hands pressed against her face, as if she could physically contain the shame that coursed through her. Her heels dug into the wet concrete, but the ground beneath her felt unsteady, mirroring the collapse of her pride. Every second stretched like an eternity. In 30 minutes, her carefully maintained image, the elegance, the authority, the air of superiority had been reduced to trembling. Exposed vulnerability. Across the plaza, Malcolm remained inside his office, seated behind the polished desk, long grey beard falling neatly against his chest, his expression a mixture of calm resolve and quiet authority. He did not rise. He did not speak. He merely watched the scene unfold with a patience born of decades, a silent reminder that he was always in control. Even when unseen, the officers lingered outside, quietly observing, their presence more symbolic than active. They were the visible instrument of Malcolm's planning, the subtle enforcement of his deliberate action. Laverne's humiliation was almost cinematic in its perfection. A woman who had been so arrogant, so dismissive of consequence, now entirely at the mercy of events she could neither control nor manipulate. She raised her head briefly, glancing toward the office windows. The reflection of Malcolm's steady gaze, paired with the immovable calm of his posture, struck her harder than any words could. In that moment, the realization hit her fully. She had underestimated the depth of his patience, the precision of his planning, and the weight of his dignity. Every insult she had hurled, every scornful gesture she had made, had set into motion a consequence far beyond what she imagined. A small crowd of office employees gathered at a distance, some peering curiously through the glass walls, whispering to one another about the unfolding scene. Laverne felt the weight of their eyes, the judgment unspoken but palpable. Her pride, which had once made her untouchable in their eyes, was now shattered. Every whisper, every glance amplified the sting of her public failure. The officers approached once more, handing her additional documents, notices confirming restrictions, procedural obligations, and temporary freezes on privileges she had taken for granted. Her hands trembled as she accepted them, the paper crumpling slightly under the pressure of her grip. The legal weight of Malcolm's phone call, the signed document, and his foresight now manifested in tangible reality. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the papers. The humiliation hit in waves, first disbelief, then anger, and finally, a creeping, bitter acceptance of powerlessness. She had thought herself clever, invincible, untouchable. Now she was stripped bare, forced to confront the consequences of her own arrogance. Malcolm, inside, reached for the phone once again. His long grey beard caught the light as he moved, a subtle visual reminder of time, experience, and quiet authority. A few gentle words were exchanged on the line, calm, concise, and deliberate, and yet the impact was immediate. The chain reaction he had orchestrated continued to unfold outside, leaving Laverne with no recourse but submission. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she glanced around at the plaza. The wet concrete reflected her broken form, the distant officers, and the looming office building behind her. Everything seemed exaggerated, heightened, as though the world itself had conspired to make her humiliation complete. She finally spoke, voice barely audible, trembling with desperation. "Dad, I can't." The words hung in the air, unfinished, powerless. Malcolm's calm, patient presence inside the office rendered her pleas unnecessary. The lesson had been delivered, meticulously, silently, and irrevocably. She sank further into the bench, overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. Her pride had been shattered, her authority stripped, and her dignity compromised before witnesses. Each wave of realization intensified the humiliation, the recognition that her own words and actions had led her to this point, and that no external defense could save her now. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected both the sky and her trembling form. She stared into them, seeing herself as the world now saw her, diminished, humbled, and exposed. In the reflection, Malcolm's silhouette behind the office windows seemed larger, stronger and immovable, a quiet titan of patience and justice. Time slowed. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and uneven, echoing the rhythm of her panic. And yet, through it all, Malcolm remained seated, silent, composed, a symbol of enduring wisdom and authority. By the time the next half-hour passed, Laverne's hands were wet from wiping her tears, her blouse damp from the drizzle. She had no escape, no argument, no pride left to wield. The officer's quiet observation and the unfolding legal consequences reinforced the reality she could no longer deny. The reckoning she had mocked had arrived, and it was merciless. She lowered her head, chest rising and falling in exhaustion, and whispered one final thought. I should have never underestimated him. Inside, Malcolm's eyes softened briefly as he watched her struggle. His long grey beard shimmered faintly in the fading light of the office, a testament to patience, foresight, and quiet power. No words were necessary. She had learned the lesson. The punishment had been delivered. The balance restored, and in the silent office, the city's normal rhythm continued outside, oblivious to the poetic justice that had been wrought in 30 minutes, leaving Laverne humbled, powerless, and forced to reckon with the consequences of her own arrogance. By mid-morning, Laverne's humiliation had fully matured into desperation. The plaza outside the office had emptied of curious onlookers, leaving her alone with the weight of her own mistakes. The wet pavement mirrored her trembling figure, each puddle reflecting the collapse of her pride and authority. Her heels had left faint scratches in the concrete as she shifted uncomfortably, trying to find footing both physically and emotionally. Every step she took was hesitant, careful, as if the world itself had shifted beneath her. Inside the office, Malcolm remained calm and composed, seated behind his desk, long grey beard falling gracefully over his chest, hands resting lightly on the polished surface. The phone sat to his side, still warm from the brief call he had made, a quiet tool of precision. He did not move toward Laverne. He did not speak. Yet the authority emanating from his presence filled the entire lobby and spilled subtly into the plaza outside. His silence carried more weight than any words could. It was a deliberate, unshakable signal that every action had consequence. The officers had stepped back slightly, allowing Laverne to feel the full scope of her predicament. Any attempt at defiance, any protestation was met with quiet authority. a reminder that Malcolm's patience was as deliberate as it was strategic. She clutched the crumpled documents in her hands, scanning them again and again, hoping for some error, some loophole, some reprieve. But the legal weight of her situation was flawless, calculated, precise, and immediate. Her mind raced, frantically attempting to process how quickly her life had shifted. 30 minutes earlier, she had wielded authority, belittled her husband, and exposed him to her peers with the arrogance of someone certain of victory. Now she was the one exposed, vulnerable, trembling, and entirely powerless. "Dad, please. I can't," she whispered, voice cracking with desperation. Tears fell freely now, mixing with the lingering drops of rain on her blouse. She tried to stand, to regain some semblance of dignity, but every movement reminded her of her vulnerability. The wet pavement threatened her balance, and the weight of the documents made her hands ache. Malcolm's calm gaze followed her from inside the office, unwavering. Every line of his posture communicated the unspoken truth. You cannot outrun consequence, nor can arrogance withstand patience and foresight. The world had tilted beneath her feet, and she was left grasping for control that no longer existed. The city around them continued its routine, oblivious to the private devastation that had been orchestrated in such a short span. Cars hummed by, office workers filed past the plaza, and yet Laverne felt the stillness of her own personal storm. Each breath she took was heavy, laden with regret and realization. She had underestimated the quiet authority of the man she had mocked, the patience of someone who understood timing, precision, and the inexorable force of poetic justice. The officers, still present, gave a subtle nod to each other, an acknowledgement of the scene unfolding. They were not there to humiliate, nor to participate in revenge. They were instruments of consequence, carrying out the precise mechanisms set into motion by Malcolm's foresight. Laverne now fully understood that her misjudgment had not merely embarrassed her. It had activated a chain reaction she could not control. Her legs gave way, and she sank to the ground beside the bench, clenching the documents tightly against her chest. Her head bowed, hair damp from rain and tears alike. The power she had wielded so freely moments ago had evaporated, leaving her with nothing but the weight of her mistakes and the growing realization of her own fragility. Inside the office, Malcolm rose slowly, long grey beard catching the sunlight spilling through the windows, a visual emblem of enduring wisdom and control. He walked toward the window, observing Laverne as she huddled on the ground. His steps were measured, deliberate, a visual lesson in dignity and composure. Every movement was calm, precise, and filled with silent authority. Laverne looked up, eyes red and swollen, and saw him framed in the office window. Her knees shook as she tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. She had believed herself untouchable, and now she understood the true meaning of helplessness. Her mind screamed with regret, yet there was no immediate solution, no escape, no appeal to her previous arrogance. She was entirely at the mercy of consequence. Finally, she raised her trembling hands toward the window, voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "Dad, I'm sorry. Please." Malcolm's eyes softened, but he remained still. The lesson had been delivered. His patience, foresight, and silent orchestration had ensured that her arrogance met its full consequence, leaving her humbled, broken, and entirely aware of the price of disrespect. The rain had cleared completely now, and the plaza reflected a pale, diffused sunlight. A new day, symbolic of clarity, awareness, and the inevitability of justice. Laverne remained on the ground, shivering slightly, not just from the lingering cold, but from the weight of the lesson she could never forget. In that quiet moment, Malcolm's long grey beard shimmered softly in the sun, a timeless emblem of wisdom, patience, and the quiet authority that had orchestrated every ripple of consequence. The city moved on around them, but the private universe of lesson, humility, and poetic justice remained sealed, a permanent, inescapable truth for the woman who had once insulted, mocked, and underestimated her husband. The morning sun had fully risen, casting a soft golden light across the plaza outside Malcolm's office. Laverne remained on the damp concrete, shivering not from cold but from the crushing weight of her own humiliation. The papers in her hands felt heavier than lead, each document a testament to her arrogance and to the meticulous orchestration of consequences by the man she had scorned. Inside, Malcolm sat behind his desk, long grey beard neatly combed, catching the first rays of sunlight, his posture calm and regal. He had observed every moment of the unfolding scene, every faltering step, every shudder of pride breaking into despair. His patience, unshakable and deliberate, had allowed time and circumstance to teach the lesson more profoundly than any words ever could. Outside, the officers maintained a respectful distance. They were silent witnesses to the final act, not enforcers of punishment for pleasure, but executors of justice as determined by Malcolm's foresight. Laverne's cries, barely above a whisper, reached their ears, yet none intervened beyond the necessary legal procedure. The scene had already been set. Laverne raised her head, streaked with tears, her blouse damp and sticking to her arms, hair plastered to her forehead. She looked up at the office windows, meeting Malcolm's calm gaze. The realization struck her fully. Her humiliation was complete, irreversible, and entirely self-inflicted. She had insulted, mocked, and underestimated him, and now the weight of consequence bore down with full force. Her knees buckled slightly as she tried to approach the office entrance, but the wet pavement betrayed her, forcing her to pause. She looked around, and the plaza seemed emptier than it had moments before. The city's normal rhythm continued. Car engines hummed. Distant chatter of pedestrians floated past, yet the intensity of her personal reckoning created a stark contrast, isolating her in a bubble of shame and despair. Finally, she crawled toward the office gate, clutching the documents as if they were a lifeline. Her voice, weak and quivering, broke into a desperate plea. "Dad, please, help me. I didn't mean it." Malcolm rose from his chair slowly, long grey beard swaying slightly with the motion, every step deliberate, almost ceremonial. He moved to the window, standing tall, silent, his calm presence filling the space between them. Words were unnecessary. The authority, the wisdom, the patience of decades communicated more than any apology could. The officers, sensing the completion of the orchestrated lesson, nodded subtly to one another. The enforcement had been executed flawlessly. The consequences were in place. The arrogance that had once dominated the morning was now entirely replaced by vulnerability and remorse. Laverne's tears streamed freely, her pride utterly dismantled. She sank to her knees at the office gate, finally understanding the depth of the man she had mocked. Every insult, every gesture, every scornful word had contributed to this collapse. And yet Malcolm did not gloat. He did not shout. He did not add to her suffering. He simply watched, silent, dignified, his long grey beard a visual emblem of time, wisdom, and enduring authority. For a long moment the plaza was quiet, except for the distant hum of the city. Laverne's sobs subsided into quiet, shaking breaths. She had no power, no leverage, no way to escape the lesson. Malcolm's gaze remained calm, unwavering, a reminder that dignity and patience always triumph over anger and arrogance. Finally, the officers approached gently, guiding her to her feet and ensuring she complied with the remaining procedural requirements. Laverne moved mechanically, every step heavy with regret. She glanced back at Malcolm, who returned her gaze with a calm, almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear. The lesson had been delivered. The balance restored and justice, silent and absolute, had prevailed. Laverne's collapse was complete, but Malcolm's silence carried the ultimate power. He had acted not with anger, but with measured foresight. In 30 minutes, a lifetime of arrogance had been dismantled. In 30 minutes, respect had been demanded, humility instilled, and poetic justice served. The office windows reflected the morning sun, shimmering off Malcolm's long grey beard. It was a symbol of endurance, patience, and quiet authority. Laverne, at the gate, finally understood the full weight of her mistake. She bowed her head, silent, broken, aware that no words could undo the lesson she had earned through pride, insult, and misjudgment, and as she looked up one last time, the realization settled fully into her mind. Silence can be stronger than anger, patience more powerful than pride, and wisdom more fearsome than any insult. The world outside moved on, oblivious, but within that small plaza, a timeless story of consequence, dignity, and poetic justice had been written, a lesson that Laverne would carry forever.